Success stories. At the leadership session of each quarterly state conference held in 1966, two people were assigned to tell a 3-minute success story. That is, each was asked to describe some segment of his success which might be made negotiable in the bloodstream of the other leaders in attendance. Everyone is a natural collector by divine instinct. Small boys collect marbles, chalk, a fishing rod, and a chicken's foot. Girls fill hope chests with beautiful things. Businessmen collect real estate, stocks and bonds, and insurance policies. Some misguided people collect a tobacco breath, lung cancer, dope addiction and venereal disease. This hoarding instinct was intended for our good and goes through all nature. The squirrel hoards up acorns. The bee stores up honey. The winter hibernation of the bear is supported by his excess of summer's fat. And when God created man in his own image, he generously endowed him with this hoarding instinct. We preserve food in the growing season to carry over until the next spring. We carry over the great literature of the past to motivate our present accomplishment. We have a natural instinct to acquire which is supported and increased by our natural inclination to save. James Barrie once said that, memory enables us to have roses in December. Jesus said that, we should lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And since 1966, I have stored away in my treasury 72 success stories. This hoarding place is like a stockroom containing the spare parts for success, and I may slip one of these little segments of success into my personal machinery, to help me to reach any desired accomplishment. Success story number 1. At the death of Julius Caesar, the world was divided into two great war camps, one led by the conspirators under Brutus, and the other led by Octavius Caesar and Mark Antony, the friend of Julius Caesar. During the long hard war that followed, Mark Antony distinguished himself as the greatest general in the world. Success has much in common with itself wherever we find it, and if we can discover what causes it, we can reproduce it in our own success pattern. Here are some of the things that were said of Mark Antony, armed with his convincing speech, the power of his logic, the courage of his leadership, and his own self-discipline. He swept everything before him. He took upon himself the hardest tasks with the most wondrous good cheer. He often lived for weeks on a diet of insects and the bark of trees. He won the unquestioned loyalty of his men, the acclaim of the people, and the support of Octavius. Finally, opposed by such dedication and industry, the enemy generals one by one began to drop out of the fight, and finally, when the war was won, Mark Antony stood where the great Julius Caesar had once stood as the master of the world. However, when the need for struggle had passed, Mark Antony became idle. And inactivity is probably the most serious mistake that anyone can ever make. When we tie up an arm in a sling, the muscles begin to disintegrate. The mole didn't use his eyes, and so nature took away his eyesight. We become inactive in the church and we lose our faith. And Mark Antony made the serious mistake of condoning idleness. He went to Egypt and fell in love with the bewitching Queen Cleopatra. He became the victim of the soft luxury, perfumed elegance, and immorality of the Egyptian court. His great mind became clouded by the fumes of wine, and as Mark Antony abandoned his better self, his great personality began to disintegrate. Then Mark Antony lost the loyalty of his men, the acclaim of the people, and the support of Octavius. Finally, a guard of Roman soldiers was sent to Egypt to take Mark Antony into custody and bring him back to Rome in chains. It didn't require an army to take Mark Antony now. Just a handful of the most ordinary soldiers was all that was necessary. Mark Antony avoided arrest by thrusting a dagger into his own heart, and as he lay dying, he recounted to Cleopatra that there had been no power in the world sufficient to overthrow him except his own power. He said, only Antony could conquer Antony. And then as he lay dying, contemplating the arrival of the Roman soldiers, and the pitiful disgrace that he had brought upon his family, the great country that he served, and the friends that he had disappointed, Mark Antony made his last speech, in which he said to Cleopatra, let not Caesar's servile minions mock the lion thus laid low. 'Twas no foeman's arm that felled him, 'twas his own hand struck the blow. He who pillowed on thy bosom, turned aside from glory's way, when made drunk with thy caresses, madly threw a world away. Mark Antony had held securely in his own hands the controls of an entire world, and there was no one with enough power to take it away from him except his own power. Only Antony could conquer Antony. But every one of us has within his reach a world far more valuable than that which belonged to Mark Antony. There is no power in the world which can stand between us and the celestial kingdom, except ourselves. And yet, by a few misdeeds, we can throw away the greatest value in the universe with the reckless abandon of a drunken Mark Antony. Success story number 2 comes from John Bunyan's great book Pilgrim's Progress. You may remember the man with the muckrake, who had spent his entire lifetime raking unto himself the chaff and dust of the earth. There was an angel standing over his head with a celestial crown in his hand, offering to exchange the crown for the muckrake. But this man had trained himself to look in no direction but down, and so he disregarded the offer of the angel as he continued to rake unto himself the chaff and muck of the earth. But there is an angel standing over our heads with a celestial crown in his hand, offering to confer it upon us if we can just look up to God in righteousness and obedience. The beast was put down on all fours, and thus his vision is cast upon the ground. But man was created upright in the image of his Maker, that he might look up. Success story number 3 is one of the great stories of all time. It was taken from Grecian mythology and has to do with Pygmalion and Galatea. Pygmalion was a sculptor from Cyprus, and like all great artists, Pygmalion loved his work. And then the day came when Pygmalion would create the great masterpiece of his life. In deathless ivory he would carve the statue of a beautiful woman and show the human form and human personality at its best. Week after week and month after month he labored until finally the statue was completed. But so great was the devotion and love that Pygmalion had lavished upon his work that the gods decreed that the statue should have the power to move and breathe and live. And as the statue stepped down off the pedestal, Pygmalion called her name Galatea. And then Pygmalion married his work. But this is far more than just an interesting myth, for the story of Pygmalion is the story of every man who is ever born into the world. For the great God of creation has decreed that every man who falls in love with his work shall live. Success story number 4 is centered in the life of the lion-hearted King Richard, who ruled England in the latter part of the 12th century. Richard organized a crusade to go to the Holy Land to dispossess the Turks of the Sepulchre. However, the expedition was unsuccessful and Richard himself was captured and confined to a foreign prison. During his absence at home, traitors had taken over the government, and when Richard finally effected his escape and returned to England, it was necessary for reasons of his own personal security that he come disguised in plain, unmarked armor. When back in England, he quietly gathered around him a few of his faithful followers with the idea of putting England back into the hands of its rightful rulers. When this little group had been assembled, one of the first things Richard did was to attack the castle at Torquilstone. Torquilstone was a stronghold of the enemy in which Ivanhoe, the faithful follower and friend of Richard, was wounded and imprisoned. When Ivanhoe heard the noises of assault begin to take place outside the castle, and because of wounds and loss of blood, he was unable to raise himself from his couch. He asked his nurse Rebecca to stand by the window and tell him what was taking place. And the first thing he wanted to know was who the leader was. And that is the first thing that anyone wants to know about anything. And so he asked Rebecca to describe for him the insignia or marks of identification on the armor of the leader. Then he would know who the leader was and what their chances for rescue were. However, Rebecca reported back that the leader fought in plain, unmarked armor and had no insignia or marks of identification. Then Ivanhoe said, "Then tell me how he fights, and then I will know who he is." Everyone has a set of traits about as characteristic as his fingerprints. And if you could know what he does, you will have a pretty good idea who he is. Then Rebecca tried to describe this great warrior clad in plain, unmarked armor as he swung his ponderous axe with thunderous blows, assaulting this castle stronghold almost single-handed. Rebecca said, "Stones and beams are hurled down from the castle walls upon him, but he regards them no more than if they were thistledown or feathers." Again she said, "He fights as if there were 20 men's strength in his single arm." Again she said, "It is fearful yet magnificent to behold how the arm and heart of one man can triumph over hundreds." Now I suppose that Richard's arm wasn't any stronger than any other warrior's arm, but that is the arm and heart of one man. Richard was fighting not where strength comes from. Rebecca had said with his heart. He was fighting for England. When someone begins to put his heart into what he is doing, then things really begin to happen. Ivanhoe didn't know who this man was. He knew that Richard fought like this, but no one fought like Richard, and he believed Richard to be a prisoner in an Austrian dungeon. He said, "I thought there was but one man in England who might do such deeds," and then he paid this tribute to an unknown leader. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew the qualities that characterize greatness, and he said to Rebecca, "I swear by the honor of my house I would endure 10 years of captivity to fight a single day by that great man's side in such a quarrel as this." Captivity would have been the greatest punishment to which Ivanhoe could have been subjected, yet he said, "I would gladly languish 10 years in a dungeon cell for the privilege of fighting by the side and under the banner of a great man and a great cause." Now we have a great cause. We have the greatest cause. And the only question that remains to be answered is, how will we fight? And in our own day, our own leader has said to us, "O ye that embark in the service of God, see that ye serve him with all your heart, might, mind and strength, that ye may stand blameless before God at the last day." D&C 4-2. A few years ago, a friend of mine asked me to come to the hospital and give him a blood transfusion. And as I sat there on the cot watching the blood run out of my arm, I asked the nurse how many blood transfusions I could safely give in the course of a year. And she said it would be perfectly all right to give 4. That is, if it were necessary, I could save the lives of 4 people every year by a transfusion of my blood. And then I thought of the great people along the way who had given me some transfusions. Some transfusions of faith and some transfusions of courage and industry. And I would like to close by giving you a transfusion from the testimony of the first great prophet of the last dispensation, when he said, "And now, after the many testimonies that have been given of him, this is the testimony last of all that we give of him, that he lives, for we saw him, even on the right hand of God. And we heard the voice bearing record that he is the only begotten of the Father, that by him and through him and of him the worlds are and were created, and the inhabitants thereof are begotten sons and daughters unto God." D&C 76-22-24. And may God help us to make this testimony a vital power in our success program. I humbly pray, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.